All right. I hope the same thing happened last time. It should be fine.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. That was Gerald Ford on August 9th, 1974, moments after becoming president of the United States. He was trying to reassure a country that had watched its previous president resign in disgrace. Ford went on to say, quote, "Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men." But that line, our long national nightmare, raises a question. When did the nightmare begin? Was it the break-in at the Watergate complex? Was it the war in Vietnam? Was it the secret bombing of Cambodia? Was it inflation? Was it gas lines? And a feeling that the future had gotten smaller. Today, we are tracing the unraveling of confidence in the early 1970s, beginning with Richard Nixon's promise to restore order and ending with Jimmy Carter's promise to restore honesty.
And that's really the thread for today, trust. Because Nixon comes to power by telling Americans that the country can regain control over war, protests, crime, disorder, even inflation, and America's place in the world. But of course, the irony is that Nixon's presidency both rebuilds and destroys that very confidence. He helps open relations with China, and he negotiates with the Soviet Union. He ends direct U.S. combat involvement in Vietnam, but he also expands the war and hides information and uses his power pretty recklessly, ultimately leaving office in disgrace as the first president ever to resign. So ultimately, today's episode is not just, Nixon's fall. It's really about a nation exhausted by crisis and a president who promised stability while deepening the very crisis of authority he claimed he could solve. And normally, Keltner would be pressing.
I was just like, I know. I look over,
where is
and
she?
I'm like, she's gone. She's the noise master.
Yeah, she's the button presser.
I was like, what are we missing today? And there's a gaping hole.
Yeah, literally
where Miss Keltner was, and
where she would normally sit. Yeah,
I feel a little.
There's an absence here.
Rudderless?
Yeah.
I don't know what it is.
But we're going to soldier on. Keltner will be back. Don't worry. She hasn't left the show or the school or the state, anything like that. She'll be back. But for today, Mr. Hill and I we're going to carry this thing forward.
Yeah, we're going to do what we can.
It's going to be a good episode.
Despite all of the conspiracies and scandals related to why Miss Keltner is gone.
Right, we don't want to bring those.
Yeah,
we're not going to say anything else about that.
Listen, exactly. And if you have heard something, please keep it to yourself. Don't spread it to other people.
Right.
That you know how these things
we don't
spread
want
like wildfire.
Wiretapping or
we
don't want
see where
like
the wiretapping got us last time.
Exactly. So we're going to ignore all the controversy around Keltner and just push forward. Please, no more questions, and let's go.
So let's quickly reset to the election of 1968. The country is raw. Martin Luther King has been assassinated. Robert Kennedy has been assassinated. Cities are burning. Anti-war protests are going on. We're at the apex of the Vietnam conflict. The DNC, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, becomes a televised disaster of police violence and party division. And Nixon sees an opening here. He does not run as a revolutionary. He runs as a restorer. His message is, I understand what would be a Nixon? I understand the decent, hardworking Americans who are not marching, not rioting, not on television every night, but who are deeply worried about the country.
That was good.
Nah, that wasn't bad.
That was a good Nixon.
I kind of slid into that. It's frightening to me how
got
easy that is.
Kind of grumble. He always sounds kind of
little
angry.
gravelly. I always think of this whenever I'm about to imitate Nixon. I always think of like, I'm not a crook.
Yeah,
I was. There's that.
That anchors you into
Which,
the
was he a
character.
crook or not? I think he was. Okay.
Didn't say it very convincingly. And that Nixon's promise is what becomes the idea of the silent majority, probably one of the more effective political strategies in modern American history, because Nixon is basically using the phrase in the late 1960s as a way to ask for support from what he called, quote,
the Southern strategy.
No, I was going to have you read the quote because you
okay. So, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans.
Boom. And so the political strategy is in place. He's basically going to make this argument that, look, most Americans are hardworking people. They just put their head down and they get after it. They don't protest. They aren't in the streets. They aren't burning their draft cards, and they don't make a lot of noise, but they make up the majority of America. And then he connects that to what will be known as the Southern strategy. Basically, Nixon and Republican strategists understand that there's a lot of white Southern voters who are slowly leaving the Democratic Party. And this comes after, for example, when Truman first integrates the military, that causes some issues. When civil rights legislation comes out of the Great Society and leads to a lot of anger and protest, more and more white Democrats are starting to become Dixiecrats and separate themselves. So Nixon really understands that he doesn't have to worry about those voters voting for the Democratic Party anymore because they're likely going to vote for this guy, George Wallace. And Wallace is an open segregationist. That's his only platform, is segregation today, tomorrow, and forever. Nixon kind of knows, look, I'll either allow Southern Democrats to vote for Wallace, or some of them will just simply come over to my side of things. And so he talks about law and order, local control, local crime, and this growing resentment toward the liberal elite that are seen as out of touch with the silent majority.
Exactly. And so Wallace is it's so inflammatory, and Nixon knows that, hey, this is a great spot to be in, actually, despite the fact that 1968 and the end of the 60s is such a hysterical time in America. He's like, I'm stuck in between people getting sick and tired of the liberal, progressive, elitist kind of approach, and way over on the other side of the football field, you've got like the extreme racist approach. And so while Wallace is yelling, racist, tirades and stuff, Nixon translates that into respectable national politics.
And then he also is able to sort of position himself in an interesting way on Vietnam, and really sort of says that the Democratic Party is this party of failing to win the war, and Nixon is going to promise what he calls an honorable end to the war, peace with honor. So at the Republican convention, he says that the first foreign policy priority of his administration will be to bring an honorable end to the war in Vietnam, and that sounds a lot better than the quagmire that the Democrats had found themselves in.
And it's really important that he uses that phrase and not just like, oh, I'm immediately pulling everybody out of Vietnam. 1968, we were at the apex of boots on the ground in Southeast Asia. So Nixon is not promising immediate withdrawal. He's promising withdrawal without humiliation, and that means the United States has to leave, but in a way that still will look like strength. So when Nixon does take office in 1969, the war is still grinding on. More than 500,000 U.S. troops are in country. And the American public is so tired, and Nixon believes simply pulling out would, maybe rightfully so, damage U.S. credibility.
Which leads Nixon and his famous national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, to pursue a policy called Vietnamization. Really, the basic idea is let's train and equip South Vietnamese forces, and we'll hand this thing over to them. Sound familiar? This is kind of what the United States will try in several other instances, like in the Middle East, and basically say, look, you guys, good luck. We're going to train you, and then you'll be able to fight this war on your own, and we can bring American troops home. And the message is we're going to de-escalate. And that's kind of the idea. It makes for a good TV image for American soldiers to return home. It's very dramatic, and people like to see this. But on the other hand, Nixon knows that Vietnamization doesn't mean peace. It means how the war is going to be carried out. Who carries the burden of the war is going to change.
Right. And he pairs troop withdrawal with an escalation from the air. So he wants to pressure North Vietnam into negotiations. So the United States bombs North Vietnamese supply routes, and communist bases in neighboring Cambodia and Laos.
Yeah, kind of never really told anybody that was happening.
Wait a minute, we're not really at war with those countries, but yeah.
Just did it on the sly. And this is one of the great contradictions of the policy. He's reducing American troops, but also widening the scope of the war.
Right, and much of this is hidden from the public. Secret bombing in Cambodia begins in 1969. Then in April 1970, Nixon announces that U.S. troops are moving into Cambodia. To Nixon, to him, it's a limited move to strike enemy sanctuaries. But to anti-war Americans, this feels like a betrayal because the promise was, hey, buddy, you said you were going to wind down the war, not expand on it.
Which inflames the already volatile anti-war movement, and the reaction is immediate. College campuses in particular begin to erupt. And this culminates with Kent State. And on May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard will be called out to one of these protests, and then all hell breaks loose when they fire into a crowd of student demonstrators, killing 4 students and wounding 9. 10 days later, police kill 2 students at Jackson State College in Mississippi. And this often gets less attention in part because this was a black college. And so the national media really is focused on Kent State. But if we historically look back, we can see that across the United States, across college campuses, students of every background are rising up to protest this war overseas.
I thought this was the moment where you were going to do your Neil Young imitation.
Yeah.
And man, I got to reach back to.
I know the song.
10 soldiers and Nixon coming. We're finally on our own. This summer we hear the drumming for dead in Ohio. Man, that's you know what? Here we go.
Not bad.
Here we go. And this is where the Cold War, the old Cold War confidence really starts to crack. Americans have been told that the war was about freedom and containing communism and credibility. But now students are being shot on American campuses, and more people are asking, credibility for whom? At what cost? Then, in 1971, the Pentagon Papers explode into public view.
All right, so Pentagon Papers. These essentially were a collection of secret Defense Department documents, a part of a large study of the overall U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and they've been commissioned, or kind of the whole reason for their existence was set out during the Johnson administration to really show and document from a historical and academic point of view the actions that American leaders had taken. And why those actions were taken. But the documents actually will reveal repeatedly that American leaders had misled the public about the war's progress and overall prospects.
And the detail that is contained in the Pentagon Papers is so reflective of Robert McNamara, who was the defense secretary at the time. He is such a bear for details, and so in this way, it's so like complete with the most minute details. So when Daniel Ellsberg, this former Defense Department analyst, gets his hands on this and he starts reading through this, there's so much there. There's so much, information to sink your teeth into. So he decides to leak the documents to the press. The New York Times begins publishing the excerpts in June of 1971. The Nixon administration tries to stop the publication, claiming this is a huge breach of national security.
And we should say in our classes, we all show the Post about how the Washington Post becomes the second newspaper to join the Times and continue publishing the papers after the Nixon administration had shut down the New York Times. And across the board, our students love this movie.
Yeah,
they
absolutely.
really liked it.
They did.
And I thought about it a lot. I think some of it is our students aren't used to seeing moral stands I really, in the press and in national politics, I think that might be it.
Absolutely.
Seeing someone like fighting for a First Amendment and standing up and doing the right thing, you don't see that a lot.
And you know what? Let's give credit where credit's due. I think our students are also maybe a little bit more cerebral than we give them credit for.
They really thought about it.
They're thinkers.
And it's a cool story, right? Because the case goes to the Supreme Court, New York Times versus the United States. And the court rules that the government had not met this heavy burden required to justify what's called prior restraint. In other words, the government can't prevent publication. They can't censure publication unless it's just immediately obvious that it was going to do damage to the country. And that wasn't the case here. So free press, right?
Yeah,
free press wins.
And that outcome is huge because, freedom of the press. This is the highest court in the country, putting their stamp of approval. I don't know if those are the right words or not, but politically, it also convinces Nixon that leaks are an existential threat to his administration. So the White House becomes even more obsessed with secrecy and enemies and control. And I mean, this guy is so paranoid, and that connects directly to Watergate. The Pentagon Papers do not cause Watergate by themselves, but they do help create the atmosphere. And Nixon's team forms a secretive quote-unquote plumbers unit because what do plumbers do? They stop leaks, right? When a government starts treating criticism as conspiracy, it can talk itself into some pretty dangerous things.
And that's really the key here. The context of Watergate is important. It wasn't just a random burglary. It wasn't Nixon sort of randomly saying, I want to go ahead and bug the DNC. It comes out of this growing fear and do you hear music?
It's my phone. Hold on.
What's that? Is that a call?
It's my ringtone is. Did you ever watch Bosch on? I think it was on Prime Video.
Oh, the
detective, the L.A. detective.
That's your ringtone.
I loved the opening, and so I was like, "Hey, wait, that sounds like Bosch. Where's that? Oh yeah, it's my phone."
I thought maybe I was starting to hallucinate, but I'm paranoid.
You're being paranoid.
Yeah, maybe
like
maybe someone was listening in on us.
Yeah, nobody else.
With all this Keltner controversy.
Yeah, nobody else heard anything.
So Watergate comes out of this fear and anxiety that comes out of the Pentagon Papers. Everyone's kind of fearful that important information will continue to be leaked. And it ultimately, though, it grows out of this climate of war and secrecy and who has power and paranoia. So while Nixon is struggling to get out of Vietnam, he's also trying to figure out, how do I shape the Cold War and how much power do I have?
So this is where Nixon and Kissinger are at their most strategic, we'll say. They know the communist world is not one singular united bloc. So China and the Soviet Union are both communist, but they are also rivals.
And Nixon makes one of the most dramatic diplomatic moves of the 20th century. He opens up relations with the People's Republic of China. And this is really striking because Nixon had really built much of his career as a really hardline anti-communist, even going back to like the McCarthy era. And so this actually kind of opens up room for him to maneuver. A liberal Democrat doing the same thing might have been attacked as sort of soft on communism, but Nixon has this sort of background of being strictly anti-communism, and now he can say, like, look, I know what I'm doing, and this is a strategy, and so this is really going to be important for us in the long game.
Right. I think, I mean, as far as secretaries of state, people like Henry Kissinger, they come and they go, secretaries of state, and depending on the administration, really depends on how active your Secretary of State is in your administration. This guy was super active.
You get the sense that Kissinger was behind a lot of this.
Absolutely. So in February of 72, Nixon travels to China, and he meets with Mao and Zhou Enlai. And this visit does not immediately normalize relations by any stretch, but it changes the global map. And the United States can now use its opening to China as leverage in dealing with the Soviet Union.
Which is essentially what we call détente. And for APUS students, détente is one of the more important concepts to take away of the Cold War, we talk so much about containment and domino theory. Détente is sort of this next step of easing tensions. It doesn't end the Cold War. The Soviets and the Americans don't become friends, but it starts to kind of ease those tensions and manage the rivalry through careful negotiation about arms control, diplomacy, and the Cold War becomes far less dramatic.
Yeah, and the ice is thawed just a little bit off of the frostiness that used to be the Cold War. And so shortly after the China trip, Nixon goes then to Moscow. And the United States and the Soviets, they sign a Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT I, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And again, this does not end the arms race. But what it does is suggest that even superpowers with nuclear weapons can place some limits on confrontation. So Nixon's foreign policy is pretty complicated here. In Southeast Asia, he escalates and he kind of hides. And in China and the Soviet Union, he is flexible, he's kind of creative, and in a lot of ways, he's kind of bold too.
Which matters because we need some complexity around Nixon. He's not just this cartoon villain, which is how he's often portrayed. In hindsight, he's a pretty capable figure. He has some real major diplomatic achievements. He does a lot of stuff in the environmental area too that many people wouldn't really think of associating with him. But ultimately, we need to remember that he has these successes alongside major abuses of power. Right, so it's January 1973. Nixon announces that an agreement has been reached to end the Vietnam War and achieve what he had always promised, which was to bring peace and honor in Vietnam.
Right, and this is the Paris Peace Accords that will allow U.S. troops to leave and American POWs to come home. But the agreement does not really settle the conflict between North and South Vietnam.
Which is the painful reality of this. The United States gets to exit and sort of have this moment, but the war, it continues. And in 1975, North Vietnamese forces are going to capture Saigon, which every American general, military figure, strategist knew that this was going to happen. No matter how many weapons or training we gave to the South Vietnamese, they were never going to be able to hold up. And so South Vietnam collapses, and there are images, famous images, of helicopters evacuating the last people from rooftops. And it becomes a symbol of a war ending, ultimately not with triumph like Nixon had hoped, but with kind of a sad desperation.
Yeah, and this is I can completely remember when that happened. I was 8 years old, and I can remember on the news, clear as day, those images of people hanging off the bottom of helicopters, and that was crazy. I can remember being glued to that. And
what I always thought was crazy is when you see the picture of the people like punching other people because so many people are on these helicopters they couldn't take off. And so why were they so desperate? Well, they knew that if they didn't get on these last helicopters, once they were captured by the North Vietnamese,
they were dead.
It was over because they had worked with anybody who had worked with or supported the Americans were basically going to disappear.
Absolutely. And so the human cost is going to be enormous, the fallout here. The National Archives lists 58,220 U.S. military fatal casualties in the Vietnam War. And Vietnamese deaths, military and civilian, North and South, were obviously vastly higher than that. The war also spills into Cambodia and Laos, as we mentioned earlier, destabilizing the entire region. After the U.S. departure, Cambodia falls to the Khmer Rouge, whose regime carries out mass murder. Vietnam is unified under communist rule. That's right, we kind of lost. Refugees flee by land and sea. So when we say the end of the Vietnam War, we have to ask the end for whom?
And really, Americans see this as an end of a nightmare, and it brings some relief. But for many in Southeast Asia, it means a new chapter of violence, displacement, and authoritarian rule.
And yet, politically, Nixon is riding high in 1972.
Right, yeah. I mean, despite all of this happening in the background, I always tell my students you have to understand that multiple things are happening on simultaneous timelines. And so as Vietnam is wrapping up and coming to a close and many Americans breathe a sigh of relief, Nixon's running for re-election, and he's going up against the Democrat George McGovern, who was an extremely anti-war candidate, who's seen as very liberal. It was sort of a surprise that he got the nomination, but there was a lot of strife within the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is officially starting, the whole New Deal coalition is starting to officially break up. And Nixon says again, look, I'm the candidate of order and patriotism and competence, and I'm the one who's bringing, ultimately, give me time, I'm going to bring peace here. And the result is an absolute landslide. Nixon wins 520 electoral votes to 17.
That is crazy.
That's pretty wild, right? It's one of the biggest presidential victories in American history.
That's a beatdown. And the wildest part about this, of course, is the Watergate break-in. That happened before that election in June 72 because Nixon, he was so convinced that he was so paranoid about I'm going to lose it. I'm losing. What can I do? I need to short my presidency in some way, shape, or form. He didn't really have to do that at all. No. It played right into his hands. So you have these 5 guys that are arrested after breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in the Watergate office complex in D.C., so thus the name Watergate. At first, it looks like a strange, like you said, burglary, but then reporters, investigators too, investigative reporters in particular, and eventually Congress began connecting the burglars to Nixon's re-election campaign.
And that's where things get interesting because, yes, this break-in is bad. I mean, people are like, oh, this is pretty crazy that someone did that, but it's the cover-up that really becomes fatal.
Right, because they're never going to really prove, the authorities in this case, they're never really going to prove that Nixon really knew about the break-in at all. But his people try to hide the connections. They pay hush money. They obstruct investigations, and they control the story. Then the scandal starts to widen. There are revelations about campaign dirty tricks, enemies lists, abuse of federal agencies, and illegal surveillance.
Historian Stanley Cutler argued that Watergate cannot be separated from Nixon's personality, right? He was overly suspicious, he was resentful, and he had this belief that politics was sort of a kind of war. And other historians also point to this broader growth of presidential power during the Cold War, that increasingly you could probably go back really to FDR, the presidents had been expanding executive power. They were able to carry out more secret campaigns and do things in the name of foreign policy that probably in the past presidents wouldn't have engaged in. So Nixon brings that secrecy to its high point, right? The danger is deeper for him, and a presidency built to fight global enemies starts treating domestic opponents as enemies too.
Right, and this ultimately will be this cavernous thing that we as the American public kind of fall down into. And so the scandal cracks open in 1973. The Senate investigates. John Dean, who was Nixon's former White House counsel, testifies that there is a, quote, cancer on the presidency, unquote. Then Americans learn that Nixon secretly recorded conversations in the White House. Again, most paranoid guy of all time.
And ironically, it's that paranoia that gets him because it's the tapes that become the center of the crisis. Nixon claims executive privilege, interesting, and refuses to turn them over. So this idea of presidents saying, I'm above the law, you could kind of go back to Nixon to see where this really begins. And the question becomes, well, can presidents withhold evidence from a criminal investigation? And the Supreme Court ultimately has to rule on this. And they say, no, you can't. The court recognizes executive privilege in certain circumstances, but that is not an absolute shield against things like subpoenas in a criminal case.
Right. And then comes the smoking gun, which is the tape. It's recorded on June the 23rd, 1972, just days after the break-in. It shows Nixon approving a plan to have the CIA tell the FBI to back off the Watergate investigation. So that's obstruction of justice right there. At that point, Nixon's support starts to collapse. The House Judiciary Committee has already approved articles of impeachment. Republican leaders are telling Nixon he does not have the votes to survive.
That's an interesting thing. Nixon would have stayed in office had it not been for the fact that his party ultimately turned on him, which is why he gives an address in August 1974 where he addresses the nation and essentially announces that he's not going to fight this. He's going to resign, and he kind of tries to couch it as he's doing it for the country so the country can move forward.
He does. And in his own words, he says, "I've never been a quitter." And when he says that, and we're watching it in class, I would say like, until right now, because somebody's telling me I have to.
The narrator says, and then he quit.
And then he quit. And the next day, Gerald Ford takes the oath of office. But we also need to keep the economy in the story here, because Watergate is happening while Americans are dealing with a growing economic crisis.
Yeah, that's huge, because that post-war boom, post-World War II boom is finally starting to fade. American manufacturing is not this lone superpower anymore. We've got competition. We've got rising prices. We have this thing called stagflation, where we have inflation and unemployment. Usually they move in opposite directions, and it kind of balances each other out a little bit. But now Americans see both rising prices and relatively weak growth, especially in traditional manufacturing sectors. So now we have job insecurity, anxiety, scarcity. It's not good. And all of this starts to create what psychologists call this kind of shift. And by the early 1950s and into the 1960s, America was built on this idea of abundance. Bigger houses, bigger cars, growth, all built around confidence. But by the 1970s, we now have a different mood, or vibe, as one might say. People are worried about limits and shortages. There are lines at gas stations. There's this sense that the future might not be as bright as we once thought. And that's the bridge from Nixon to Ford and eventually Carter.
So Ford inherits a mess. He's not elected president or vice president, for that matter. He becomes vice president actually after Spiro Agnew resigned in a bribery scandal. And then he becomes president after Nixon resigns. So
yeah, we didn't even admit it.
Yeah.
Spiro Agnew. Yeah, by the way, he's also he's a crook too. I mean, it's pretty rough.
He's a crook too. And so Ford he's in this really unique position. He's a president that the people had never elected.
The only one, right?
I think it's the only one, yeah,
to become president without ever being elected into executive branch.
And so he's got this monolithic task of trying to calm the country down after all of this stuff just kind of blew up. And we didn't even mention also oil, which is like the lifeblood of our country, our economy. It's now being controlled by OPEC, which is outside of our reach.
So we got an energy crisis.
Exactly. So in many ways, he seems like the opposite of Nixon. He's kind of plain spoken, decent, Michigan guy, unglamorous, and yeah.
But also seen as a bit of a buffoon,
a little soft in the head. I think he took a lot of blows when he was taking, football.
He was a lineman for Michigan. Chevy Chase famously takes the shots at him when SNL comes out right in this moment. But 1 month into his presidency, Ford does something that many people just didn't see coming. He pardons Nixon, and he grants a full, free, and absolute pardon for any offenses he committed or may have committed as president.
That is huge. I think it was at that point where my dad maybe threw a shoe or something at our TV screen. Ford says the country needs to move on, but many Americans see the pardon as proof that powerful people can avoid being accountable, and that is devastating. Ford may have believed he was healing the country, but the pardon reinforces the very mistrust he was trying to overcome.
And meanwhile, that stagflation continues and gets worse, and Ford tries to launch this whip inflation now, a WIN acronym, encouraging voluntary restraint, which never works, and these buttons and slogans as if that could solve the structural economic problems.
Right. So by 1976, our bicentennial, by the way, the country is exhausted. Vietnam has ended badly. Nixon has resigned to avoid being impeached. Ford just pardoned Nixon. Inflation is high. Energy feels uncertain. Trust is low. Enter Jimmy Carter.
Okay, so Carter, he's a former governor of Georgia, also a peanut farmer, a very proud Baptist, and all of this makes him a complete outsider, which is something that was central to his appeal. He does not represent current Washington. He wasn't a part of Watergate or anywhere close to it. He's not part of that old machinery.
Right. And his campaign is built around honesty. In one interview, Carter says he hopes people will say, Jimmy Carter made a lot of mistakes, but he never told me a lie.
Right, and that's really his oh shucks,
Right.
What a terrible thing to say. It only works really though because in a post-Watergate world, people are like, look, just give us somebody who we could trust, even if it's a simple kind of approach to government. In 1976, that's exactly what many voters want to hear. And actually, the election is close. Carter defeats Ford, but it's not exactly a whomping victory. And so in this narrow restoration, we have a country trying to go in a different direction, but there's not a lot of confidence in this new leadership.
Right. And Carter inherits the same problems that helped elect him. He's still, none of this stuff is going to go away once he's elected. Inflation, energy dependence, this deep now distrust of the government, foreign policy uncertainty, and a public that wants honesty, but also we are expedient. We want some results. And so that's where we're going to end today, not with a clean resolution, but with a new president facing a country that has learned to doubt its leaders.
And that's not really anything new. I think we are still living in what one book famously said, Nixon shadow. We are still living under that shadow because we argue about executive power. We've been arguing. Every single president since Nixon has used executive power in ways that I think the founding fathers would have found abhorrent. This idea of government secrecy. Can American citizens truly trust what the government says? We have episodes of whistleblowers leaking information and the questions of how much freedom the press truly has. How much First Amendment rights do we still hold on to or have those been winnowed away? And the idea of protest versus patriotism, continued questions about energy independence or dependence and what that means for our international politics. And also, we recently and still are living with concerns about inflation. So all of this of the late 1970s, all of this is still very much with us.
Right. And we still debate what it means for a president to restore confidence. And so even in campaigns today, that trope of I'm not a part of the machinery, I'm not a part of Washington, I'm not a part of the swamp. I don't have any Washington experience, and that makes me a good candidate, not a bad one. Is it enough to be honest? Do people want transparency? Do they want competence? What happens when a government says one thing in public and then knows something different in private and keeps it from the American people? And maybe the biggest question, once trust is broken, how do people living in a democracy repair it?
And that's the story we're going to try to continue to tell. Ultimately, spoiler alert, the United States does not collapse in the 1970s.
What?
It turns out that we continue to have a viable constitution. We'll continue to have elections and court rulings and congressional investigations, and we have newspapers that will continue to publish. But presidents will leave office, presidents will enter office, and ultimately we've got some more waves to ride here in the upcoming decades.
Right. So survival is not really the same as confidence. And the early 1970s shows that institutions can hold and still leave people deeply shaken. That is why This period matters, A-pushers out there. It is not just about Vietnam or Watergate or gas prices. It's about what happens when Americans stop believing the official story.
So that's our official story, and thanks for tuning into it here at A Push for All. If you like the episode, be sure to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, YouTube. Leave us a review. Tell us if you got us a topic you want us to cover, and you can do that by sending us a message on Instagram at A Push for All. Mr. Hill, take it away here.
You know what? I feel like kind of an imposter.
But somebody's got to do it. I think it's got to be you.
Miss Kellner, I hope you're listening.
You know what you should do?
What?
Do your impression of Kiltner.
Oh, let's see. Until next time, keep learning from yesterday to make sense of today.
Perfect.